Hello, my name is Pooja. Welcome to another episode of Around the World. Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis, written by Serhi Plochy, Professor of History at Harvard University, was published last year. In this book, various shocking revelations have been made about the situations which came to the fore during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Serhi Plochy has written that the data presented by the US intelligence agency CIA regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis was wrong in several instances. Significantly, the CIA confirmed the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba on 14th October 1962. 6 days later, the CIA came to know that some medium-range nuclear missiles capable of hitting Washington were already deployed in Cuba. But the CIA failed to find that Cuba also possessed 9 short-range Luna missiles. The power of these missiles can be gauged from the fact that these missiles were only slightly less powerful than the bomb dropped in Hiroshima. Also, the CIA did not correctly find the number of Soviet troops present in Cuba. According to the CIA, 4,000 Soviet soldiers were stationed in Cuba, but the actual figure was closer to 40,000. In his book, Plochy has mentioned that if America would have attacked Cuba, the Soviets had made all preparations to save Cuba with conventional and nuclear weapons. And if the Soviets would have attacked the US, then about 70 million US citizens would have been killed. You might be wondering why we are discussing all these things today. The Cuban Missile Crisis is in the headlines these days after a statement made by the US President Joe Biden. Actually, amid the Russia-Ukraine war going on for the last 8 to 9 months, the US President had warned of a nuclear Armageddon threat for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Against this backdrop, several pertinent questions arise. Firstly, what was the Cuban Missile Crisis and what happened during this crisis? Secondly, why is Biden talking about nuclear Armageddon now? Thirdly, why is this missile crisis being compared to the Russian-Ukraine war? We will try to find answers to these questions in today's story. But first of all, let us know about Cuba. Cuba is the largest Caribbean island country located at the confluence of the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. Cuba is located to the east of the Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, south of Florida and the Bahamas, west of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and north of Jamaica and the Cayman Islands as well. It is surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean, the Cayman Trench, the Gulf of Mexico, the Florida Straits, and the Caribbean Sea. Cuba shares its maritime borders with the US, Haiti, Honduras, Bahamas, Jamaica, and Mexico. Let us also know in brief about the then Cuban political system, which somewhere laid the foundation for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Actually, Cuba was ruled by the right-wing dictator General Batista until 1959. At that time, Cuba had deep ties with the US. But Fidel Castro overthrew Batista's regime in 1959. Later, Cuba joined the Cold War. Initially, Cuba tried to garner US support. However, the then President Eisenhower showed no interest in improving relations with Cuba and severed his diplomatic relations with Cuba in 1961. Consequently, Cuba urged representatives of the Soviet Union to support the new government. As a result, better relations were established between Cuba and the USSR. Castro presented Cuba to the world as a communist nation. In April 1961, John F. Kennedy became the President of the United States. Kennedy was a staunch opponent of communism. He planned to overthrow the communist power of Cuba and invade Cuba. For this purpose, the US Army attacked the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba. When Castro came to know about the US attacks, he ordered the Cuban Army to counter the US Army with heavy weapons. Consequently, the US Army was defeated badly. But after this attack, the leaders of Soviet Union were concerned that the US could attack Cuba at any time and overthrow the communist power in Cuba. And these concerns formed the background of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Hence, the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, decided to turn Cuba into a military base of Russia. In 1962, Khrushchev deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba. With the deployment of nuclear missiles in Cuba, the US came under the close target of Russia for the first time. The US came to know about the Soviet development of nuclear weapons in Cuba 3 weeks later. However, Kennedy and his advisors were avoiding doing anything that would lead to a nuclear war-like situation between the two countries. But at the same time, Kennedy advanced his war fleet to stop the Soviet ships from going to Cuba. Now it seemed that as if the war is going to start soon, these circumstances are known in the world history as Cuban Missile Crisis. It was seen as one of the most dangerous times of the Cold War. The fear of war had made the whole world restless because it was not a normal war. Such tense circumstances lasted for just 13 days, but the entire world believed that these tensions would lead to nuclear war. However, later both sides agreed to de-escalate and the world did not witness World War III. Now let's come back to the current situation and first of all, understand the term Armageddon mentioned by the US President. Armageddon has been referred to by the US President Joe Biden as Nuclear Armageddon. However, the first mention of the term Armageddon is found in chapter 6 of the Bible, the holy book of Christianity, which reads, "And he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon." In many places in the Bible, it is also referred to as the Battle of Armageddon, that is, the place where the final battle between good and evil will be fought. In today's world, Nuclear Armageddon is used to refer to the fictional scenario of nuclear war. In the current situation, the relevance of the term Armageddon has increased amid the increased possibility of nuclear war. According to Biden, today humanity is very close to that Armageddon, which can happen in the form of nuclear war. For instance, a situation of nuclear Armageddon was witnessed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Significantly, in the recent Russia-Ukraine war, Russia is losing its army and weapons in large numbers. Despite this, Russia did not get the desired success over Ukraine. In this fury, Putin threatened to use nuclear weapons as the last resort. Biden has warned the world that, keeping in mind Putin's nature, Russia may carry out a nuclear attack on Ukraine. If Russia's territorial integrity is threatened in any way by Ukraine and NATO, then Russia will not hesitate to use nuclear weapons first against its adversaries. Then NATO and other countries would also carry out nuclear attacks on Russia. The nuclear weapons that the world currently possesses are 1,000 times more powerful and more dangerous than the nuclear weapons used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And if a war gets fought with such destructive weapons, then the destruction of humanity is quite certain. In such a scenario, it remains to be seen whether these superpowers of the world will make the world a better place or whether they will push it towards destruction. Let us note down the question based on today's story. What was the Cuban Missile Crisis? Why the recent Russia-Ukraine war is being compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis? Thank you.